Hello and welcome to today's webinar on moving inclusively to online assessment and teaching. My name is Darragh Ryder and I am the CEO of AHEAD. If you're not familiar with AHEAD, we are a non-profit organisation focused on creating inclusive environments in education and employment. Today's webinar, just actually before we start, just to say that first things first, is that if you require closed captions for this webinar, there should be a CC button somewhere down the bottom of your Zoom controls, that if you click that, you should get captions coming up for you. So today's webinar is part of our digital accessibility webinar series, which is a series that's normally only run for members of AHEAD, but due to the kind of pandemic we're currently living through, we've made this available to everybody. So just to say thank you to those institutions and ETBs who are members of AHEAD. It's very, very helpful for us to have your support, and we're very, very grateful for it. So today's webinar really came about, I suppose, it's actually my co-host Trevor Boland who's on the line here, who is the digital media and e-learning officer for AHEAD. It was his idea. What do you think, Trevor? How did this thing come about?
Well, it was kind of just out of very ordinary circumstances, just through conversations with lecturers I know and disability staff I know. And from those, there did seem to be kind of common questions arising basically about how to support the students in this kind of unique situation we're in. So I just kind of thought, since everyone seems to be trying to find the right answers on their own, like there seems to be kind of an opportunity to help people collectively to find those answers and share hopefully some of those solutions with each other.
Yeah, I love the way you started that. It came out of very ordinary circumstances. I think we're definitely not living through ordinary circumstances. So I thank everyone today for joining us in these kind of strange and difficult times. I know it's sometimes difficult working from home in these situations. We're all delivering from home. And I suppose in that context, I'd ask you to be kind to us all here today if we do have some technical challenges as we move through, just to be aware that everybody's delivering from a difficult situation. So Trevor, if you just wouldn't mind dropping out there, but just dropping your mic and your video, I'll just continue with the session. So just to give people a sense of what's coming up in today's session. So we're going to open first with a discussion on student views on learning remotely. And that's going to be a 10 to 15 minute discussion just to get some student perspectives on how they're really finding learning from home and some of the challenges coming up and some of the positives too about learning from home. Then we're going to move on to chat with some disability officers, really about get the view from there to see what are the barriers as we move into online teaching, how are they supporting lecturers, and maybe some tips and advice for lecturers as well and what they can do to ensure equity in that move to online teaching and assessment. We're then going to move on and have some short presentations, and one focused on the pedagogical solutions really to some of this move online, and then one focused more on the kind of technical accessibility, e-learning, that kind of stuff, and what you can actually do as a lecturer to help accessibility in the move online. We're going to take then a short 5-minute comfort break just to give everyone a chance to go to the bathroom or make a cup of coffee, and then we're going to come back and host a Q&A panel. And just to say, I'm going to be hosting the first half of this session, and my colleague Trevor, who you just met, is going to take up for the second half of the session. So if you wouldn't mind, Megan and Courtney, if you wouldn't mind just unmuting your video and audio there and coming in. So this first discussion we're having is with Megan Riley, who is the VP for Equality and Citizenship with the Union of Students in Ireland, and Courtney McGrath, who is a student in Trinity College Dublin and is also the Disability Officer for Trinity College SU. How are you guys? How are you doing, Courtney?
Good, yeah.
What about you, Megan? How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Getting used to this working from home setup. My my neck was getting a bit sore after a few days, but there's a laptop stand on the way, so that'll make it.
And where are you broadcasting from, Megan?
My house in Stony Batter.
And what about yourself, Courtney? Where are you broadcasting from?
My family home in Cavan. So the internet's not that great, but it does the job.
And how are you guys finding learning and working from home? Megan, how are you?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah,
okay, so I'm finding it not too bad. Because I'm profoundly deaf, a lot of the online lectures that I don't have captions, so it has been a struggle to hear. And with the bad internet connection, like sometimes it like cuts in and out, so I've been missing content. But I think right now I've gotten used to it, and it is not as bad as it was at the beginning.
Great. On that, handy tip for everyone out there: if you are broadcasting, if you actually mute your own video when you're doing these broadcasts, you get a much cleaner audio connection. So if there is people telling you on the other side, and just today as we move through, I might occasionally do that with some of the presenters. I might actually mute their video as they're talking. So just to let people know as we move through. Megan, how are you finding working from home?
It's not so bad. I mean, you kind of just have to get used to the new online environment, I suppose. Zoom meetings started popping up pretty quickly into my calendar, and we're having quite regular team meetings as well. So that kind of stuff definitely helps. You know, it helps you feel a little bit more like you're almost in the same room as people.
Yes, we've been doing all the kind of the virtual lunch and virtual coffees in ahead here as well. So I might just start with you, Megan, just to ask in your role in USI, what are you hearing on the ground about the kind of major challenges that students are facing as they try to continue learning from home?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and look, there are definitely positives and negatives to this, but a lot of challenges sort of arose out of it. But we are constant communication with our member organisations, so all the different students' union officers from across the country, and get a bit of feedback from them, because they're doing phenomenal work putting out sort of like live Instagram Q&As or Snapchat. So, and quite often the very productive way to get just like those little snippets of what people are actually experiencing. So I mean, we were hearing everything from there's obviously a lot of general anxiety around exams at the moment from people, and I mean, we know staff are working hard in institutions to get an answer to this, but I suppose there's still just a general air of not knowing, and I mean, there's everything from the smaller things like people not being able to get their things out of lockers, you know, which would never would have been expected, all the way to what you would expect, like those kind of connectivity issues. And I think one thing about this pandemic is that what I've seen in the meetings I've been in as well is that it's really thrown into like the diversity of the student population, and that there's no one typical student. And I think this situation kind of, it makes us think a little bit more around those like marginalized groups of students, which I would work with anyway, but it's the likes of those mature students or those who have additional responsibilities, the students with disabilities or those in direct provision, and then any of those who have like intersections in who they are, and how does that impact on the fact that they may have already been facing challenges in their learning, and now we're moving into a completely new environment for a lot of people, where they wouldn't have been as used to this online approach. So I think they were kind of some of the main things that were coming up for us, a lot around the assignment deadlines, and then people trying to get those other pieces of their life into just fall into place as well. Like we would have put a lot out about accommodation for people, and you know, a lot of that is kind of on its way to being sorted now. But I think just generally a feeling around maybe wondering what's going to happen going forward for people, and in this new environment, sort of, it's an ever evolving situation. So there's kind of new challenges cropping up all the time, but solutions are being found to a lot of them. So I think that's what I'd say as a kind of introduction to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like in our discussions, we're feeding into some of the departments' steering groups on this, and so I've been part of the discussions with other groups, not just groups that are focused on disability, but amazed even some of the level of students that are coming back as having no access to any device or broadband in the, you know, from where they're living and learning. So I think that really makes us think as we move past this pandemic about how we operate as educators, and that actually we have to consider that in our everyday teaching, you know, never mind in our online teaching.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think there will be things coming out of this that will change the way that teaching and learning kind of goes forward. But I also think another thing that this has done is it puts a real focus on the sort of that partnership approach. I mean, there's obviously the students that you don't hear from, the ones who've gone a bit quiet, and those are the ones that you would worry about. So I think institutions are kind of having to grapple with how do we reach out to those students now and make sure that we maintain that connection with them, and how do we have a dialogue with people back and forward to make sure that they're providing the best resources to people who need them.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's coming across from me, and we might move across to Courtney now in 1 second. Courtney, if you could get ready and just share your screen, because I know you have a couple of slides to share with us on this. But I think one of the things that's coming out as well from discussion just having with you here, Megan, but also some discussions in the background we're having, is the absolute need for maximum flexibility in this situation. And even moving forward then, that I think, as you said, this is making educators consider more the diversity of their student body, because they're having to really look at the context of each individual learner and see how it might impact them. So I think the learner's individual circumstances and allowing educators, I suppose, or encouraging educators to reflect on all of that diversity and try to consider it when they're planning their teaching and learning, not just in this pandemic, but moving forward. Courtney, are you there? Would you like to try and share your screen with us, Courtney, in terms of this couple of slides you have? So just to cue this up, Courtney, who is a student of Trinity College Dublin and also the disability officer in TCD Students' Union, has actually done some fantastic work early on in this crisis to survey some of the students in Trinity College about their experiences of the kind of early days move online. So Courtney has really gotten to the heart of some of the challenges for students with disabilities in particular in this. So Courtney, do you want to give some of your reflections of some of the big concerns, challenges raised, and maybe also some of the positives that were brought across?
So here we have the results for how students reacted to the online learning. So we have a positive experience so far, and I thought that was surprising, but a lot of the results that we got, that the students appreciated that they could pause it and then maybe take in what they just heard and then go back over things they missed. So that was
just to give some reflections for people in the audience in case they can't see that slide. So what we're having here is 49.5% positivity and a negative response of 29% to the move online, and we have 18% mixed response. So they're really interesting results, aren't they?
Yeah, I thought there would be more negative, but actually a lot of students prefer the online approach, so it's definitely something to include for other, like the next years or whatever. So the second slide I have here is accessibility experience. So 45.5% said that the online learning is accessible, and then 27.5% said it was inaccessible, and then 17% was mixed. So an example of it being accessible, a student said that was because they can pay attention more than they normally are able to and can be more comfortable, which is good. The non-accessible responses would be there's no ISL interpreters, or with their broadband connection that they mightn't be able to participate in the online lectures.
Yeah, okay, so it's a bit of a mixed bag, and I suppose that's maybe down, there's a lot that's coming lecturer to lecturer here. Would you think?
Yeah.
So it's just in, and in terms of, was there anything raised around reasonable accommodations or anything like that, and how that might have transferred across from the kind of the face-to-face learning into the online learning?
So when it comes to reasonable accommodations for say exams that will be coming up, so that can be seen that this new way of doing exams is equal for everyone, but that's not the case. So say for myself as an example, I have a few open book exams and it's for a set amount of time, but if a student requires extra time, is that included in this time period? In Trinity we are given extra time because we need it. It's not, doesn't make it, that's it being equal like us. Sure.
So what you're saying is if there's people giving extra time for their students in exams, then we need to give extra time in when we're looking at the reasonable accommodation angle of this. Is there anything else that came up from the survey that you'd like to share with us, Courtney?
Here is results on has the online learning experience been consistent. So 47% said that has been consistent, 33% said it has been inconsistent, and 20% has said that they're uncertain. And
I think that's a big issue for some of our students with disabilities, particularly students who really are attached to that structure and routine in their learning. It's so important for certain cohorts of students with disabilities in particular.
Yeah, and one response for inconsistent was there are 2 lecturers that don't know what to do other than read old tutorials rather than new materials, which I found interesting because obviously if you're doing different modules, you have different lecturers, they're not all going to have the same, you know, way of this online teaching. Like I've had different experiences with and I know what works and what doesn't work. So I think it is important that lecturers do have consistency when delivering their online material.
I think that's great advice, Courtney. I think that's great advice. So listen, thanks very much for that. If you wouldn't mind just finishing your share, we might just go to you both, but I'll go to Megan first, if that's okay. Just some final piece of advice for our lecturers, Megan, if who are looking at particularly designing assessments now, because I know in higher education and certainly in the PLC sector in FET, there's going to be a lot of end of semester exams coming up right now, or assessments and exams, and they're going to have to do that redesign. Can I just get some advice from you, Megan, if you wouldn't mind unmuting your microphone there, and just giving us your final piece of advice for some lecturers on how they can continue to support our diverse learners?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think first and foremost, I would hope that institutions and senior management in institutions are kind of giving lecturers the resources and the tools that they need in order to be able to make this move to online, because obviously they need to be supported in that as well. But in terms of what they can do for students, I think you already touched on it a little bit, Dara, by saying that definitely the flexibility in the approach is key. And I've seen some examples online of where lecturers were reaching out via Twitter to even ask people in polls what was their kind of, you know, what way suits them. And I mean, I know I saw another thing online, my alma mater actually, anyway, Galway, they're doing live Q&A sessions with students. So that kind of helps, you know, that comes back to that partnership approach that I had kind of referred to, that they're making sure that they are consulting with students on these. And obviously this is new territory for everybody, so there's a degree of understanding there, I think, on both sides. So maybe as well the understanding that for some people this might not be to the absolute forefront of their minds because it's a stressful time and they might have other things going on, but that through communication with the lecturers, particularly I think for groups that may be already vulnerable, that they feel that sense of connection with their lecturer, whatever it is. I think that helps make it a lot better. So they would be just the thoughts that I would have on that.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, particularly when we look at things like community education in FET, that one-to-one kind of contact is so important for those types of programs, that if we can find ways to continue that communication in some way. And Courtney, just one final word before we close this discussion, maybe some advice to some lecturers on how to ensure equity in this move.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, just one final piece of advice, Courtney, if you wouldn't mind, if you were to give a lecturer one piece of advice on what they can do to make sure that, you know, they're supporting their students as they make the move to online teaching and assessment.
So basically, I would say the same as what Megan said. She has basically touched on what I think. My lecturers, myself, they have been quite understanding. I feel like that goes a long way, and if they are flexible in their approach when it comes to deadlines and to just be understanding, I feel like that will go a long way, and that's my advice to lecturers.
Great, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate both of you joining us today. I think Courtney is going to drop out, if you wouldn't mind dropping out there, Courtney, just your to mute your video and audio, and the same Megan, but we'll see you again later on. Megan is going to rejoin us for the panel session later on today. So if I could just ask Laura O'Rourke and Declan Traynor just to drop into the session here while those guys are doing that, just to queue up a few things in ahead. I'd like to raise, first of all, that in terms of how this session is structured, we're going to take, because we have a panel discussion at the end, we're going to take mostly those questions and answers at the end. I have had one question saying, how are you doing the closed captioning on this webinar? So we do have professional captioners providing that through the Zoom API. So that's something that you can do within Zoom. That's a feature that you can use. And just to flag two things we're going to actually launch today, and they should be up on the website if you'd like to click and share them. We're launching two surveys that are trying to get to the heart of some of this matter. So we're launching a national student survey about their experiences on the move online. And we're also launching a survey which is focused at FET practitioners and what's happening within their own programs in terms of how are they continuing to ensure that the learning is still happening, and also how are they continuing to ensure equity for students with disabilities in that move. So we'd ask you to share those surveys far and wide, and I will actually send the links to those in an email after the session to everybody. So first of all, to move on now, we're going to get the view from the Disability Office. So thank you for joining us, Declan Traynor, who's the Head of Disability, Trinity College Dublin, and to Laura O'Rourke, who's Head of Disability, or Disability Officer, I think is the correct title, if that's right, in Cork Institute of Technology. Welcome, guys. Did I get your titles right? I'm sorry if I didn't.
You did. You nearly gave me a promotion.
Titles.
I gave Laura a promotion. Excellent. Well, I'm happy to do so. Listen, thank you very much for joining us today, guys. I suppose my first question is, how are you finding running a disability service from your living rooms, your bedrooms, your studies, and wherever else you are at home? Laura, I might take you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think like in my experience, there's been, there's been some challenges, certainly, but like there's been a lot of positive experiences as well. I mean, like, I always like to end on a positive note. So to start with the challenges, I guess, like, for me and probably some of the members of the team as well, we're so used to working very collaboratively, and we have a lot of peer support. I think like students as well are probably missing that a little bit. There is obviously the technical challenges that we've all had to get used to. All of these Zoom meetings and MS Team meetings very, very quickly. I think the biggest challenge we've had, speaking from my own point of view in terms of the DSS and CIT, is completing a really large amount of work in a very short space of time. So I suppose what might normally take us months in terms of, policies, procedures, guidelines, all of this is now happening in, the space of literally weeks. Because obviously we want to have a lot of things ready for students so that the communication is open, and they know exactly where they stand in terms of like their reasonable accommodations, how they can access support remotely through the DSS. So it's been a lot of reconfiguring going on, I think, of services, not just with the DSS obviously, but I suppose we've had concerns about students who maybe would have like been very active in their engagement with us, and how we carry on that support in a meaningful way remotely. And that's certainly a challenge because you're depending on so many different factors, in terms of the students' capabilities around IT. I think that's really coming to the forefront now, is just the importance of basic IT skills with all of our students, not just students with disabilities. Because I think overall, going back to what Courtney has said, I think that's really interesting in terms of the findings about the experiences initially that people are having have been largely, overall positive. So I think like, hopefully there's room for this work to continue and grow. And I think like in terms of positives, like for us, there's been so much really positive collaboration between DSS and CIT and other departments. And again, this work normally may have taken much longer. So I think that's a huge positive for us, is that we're collaborating with departments like the Technological Enhanced Learning Department, IT Services. We're in constant contact with the registrar and things like that. So really, pushing the universal design, the reasonable accommodations, all of that. So it's given us a real forum to do that. So I think that's really, from my perspective, yes, there's been challenges, like every student has experienced, I'm sure out there, we're the same in terms of our team, but there has been some positives as well, I think, come out of this. So we're kind of try to cling to those a little bit.
Good to hear this positive. I know there's a lot of challenges out there at the moment. We're hearing lots of them in the head and through our helpline every day, but it's also good to know that there is some positive things coming out of this situation. Declan, how are you finding the running of the service from there?
Similar to Laura, like we're early adapters. I think we were in transition to a new building, so the staff were being weaned out of old systems into new technologies over the last year. So we left the building with the laptop, and that's what they'll be bringing back into the new building. So we were moving to a paperless office, which in a building called Printing House Square, which is a bit sort of oxymoronic, but like I think we were ready to go. Like similar, everybody, the challenges are significant, like things you'd never think about, that sort of everybody has to think about, that nobody wanted to think about, the issues around where you live, what your situation is at home, how do you get to do any work with all of the commitments that you have to do with your life and so on. And then students have different demands, and how do you take them into the online world and have meetings with them. Like we use MS Teams for student meetings, and they're working fairly well, but trying to get people in there, it was initially difficult because they didn't know there's that trust thing about how do you bring people into a thing they haven't used before very quickly. But I think because in a crisis people are more willing to adapt. I think that was one of the learnings of that. Similar to Laura again, the engagement in the university has been huge. Like I'm sitting on a high group in the college with the vice provost and the senior lecturer looking at online teaching and assessment, and we're meeting every day. So I'm in the conversation going on. So it's a huge benefit for me. I'm the voice in the room of difference. So that does help. It's learning, it's learning, and the disability officers are meeting every week as well. So we've become stronger in the sense of making sure we're all consistently doing this across all of the institutions. So we're making sure that we're not being left out of the conversation.
That's great. That's great to hear. And that whole idea of how do you bring people into this new technology that they're unfamiliar with the thing. I think that obviously applies to both the staff internally and to the students externally. So Laura, what are you finding with regards to like the move online from lectures? How has been the response been from the teaching staff there in CIT, and what are the kind of big issues that you're seeing? Like, I mean, are they considering students with disabilities in the move, or is it something that's maybe kind of an afterthought that they're in the scramble to move online? I know it's a very, very difficult situation for everybody. We're all kind of trying to be nimble and think on our feet, and sometimes it's not it's not easy to remember everything. What are you finding is the experience there in CIT?
I would say overall there has been actually a real sense of community in CIT, and probably similar in other HEIs as well. It's brought a lot of people working very closely together, as Declan has said as well. A real sense of community, collaboration, support. Like I don't think I've ever witnessed so much sharing of resources, which can only be a positive thing. People are really respecting people's viewpoints, and I think, overall in CIT, we're very lucky in terms of our lecturing staff are extremely accommodating for the most part, and everybody wants to see their students pass, thrive and do well. But I think given the circumstances here, like, there is a need for increased flexibility, and I think overall our lecturers understand that. And I think going back to something I think Megan said earlier on, there is a sense of empathy, I think, between the lecturers and the students, and this kind of overall acknowledgement that this is uncharted waters for everybody. So lecturers are having to, move all of their content now online. Not only that, they're having to consider, is it accessible, is it inclusive, how they will, I suppose, support students that have additional needs. And I think, overall, given the time period that we're all working to, that's going well for us. I hope lecturers know the DSS are here to support them. The TEL department and IT services, and I'm missing plenty here, I'm sure, have been very, very supportive overall. I think to lecturing staff and to students, and to support services as well, to enable us to keep going and providing the support. I think, as I said, the lecturers do understand there is a need for increased flexibility. Again, similar to Declan and Trinity, we're working with our registrar and others very closely in terms of, making sure reasonable accommodations are adhered to, especially given the circumstances that we're in now. They're so important. And again, it's not just, I suppose, giving every student extra time on an online assessment is not the answer here. We're all about creating a level playing field, and I suppose just to reassure any lecturers out there that this is not about giving any student an advantage. Every student needs to meet the learning outcomes. Everybody's aware of that, including the students, but also you need to give them a chance to reach their academic potential. And that might mean 10 minutes extra time in an online assessment, and it may, in some cases now, given the circumstances, mean an alternative assessment. So I think just, having the willingness to accommodate students where necessary is going to be really important going forward,
Yeah, and I think as well on that piece around the assessment, and we'll come over to you now, Declan, as well on this. It's kind of echoes a little bit back to what Declan had said. If people are trialing these new technologies, they're in new situations, then they need to be given maximum flexibility around that. They need to be given a chance to trial the technology. They need to be given a chance that if something doesn't happen right on the day, that there is other opportunities to meet their learning outcomes, whether that be through an alternative assessment or some other mechanism. Declan, what do you find? I know that you were saying you're in some high level groups there in TCD around assessment. What are you finding are the kind of major challenges or major pointers that lecturers need to consider as they're designing these assessments?
Well, I suppose all of the systems that are being used by all of the HEIs have accessibility features, but like everything around disability, they're never sort of implemented until after they've discovered there's an issue. So, we use Blackboard. They were offered the opportunity to add in the Ally, which is a piece of software in Blackboard that ensures all the materials are accessible or highlights ones that are inaccessible as well. So I get a sense that it's seen as something that we should do that rather than the college should do that. And I think sometimes that's the critical thing around, like Courtney would mention things around captioning. There was no captioning put in for this. Like it's interesting you've mentioned there's closed captioning here. I didn't know there was a functionality in Zoom. How much did that cost? They'd be the sort of things that colleges would be grappling with. How do we pay for this? But like once they get to the end of this crisis, I imagine they're going to realize that these costs are so minimal in the sense of what they really can achieve, because the diversity of the population out there in our institutions, international students, students from different backgrounds, students who can't attend lectures, who want to listen back, or students who can't concentrate in lectures and so on. The advantages of online world needs to be, you know, harnessed and looked at. So I think it's important that we sort of learn from that. Like in relation to the assessment, like that, the issue around like moving into the issues for students with disabilities, like the whole thing got very confused in this whole campaign around no detriment. And I know that all of the universities and the IoTs and so on were campaigning for this no detriment to be put into the system. The fear was in many institutions that they were not going to apply reasonable accommodation because they thought by what they were doing through the no advantage thing that it ended up being called in our institution, for example, that was enough to do for students with disabilities. So, like, I mean, my voice in the room was very clear. Legally, you have a responsibility and the student has reasonable accommodations. It's absolutely nothing to do with the situation we're in. It's a thing they have for life. It doesn't go away when the virus goes away. This is something people with disabilities live with. So the need to ensure people think, like, they don't just put everybody in a box and think, oh, we've done enough now, let's move on. So I think that sort of stuff got through very clearly in the group that I'm attending, which we're still formulating stuff as we speak. So I think the issues for students with disabilities going into these new ways of assessment is going to be the same as everybody else. There's a level of computer literacy that I'd be concerned about. Students are not fully competent with computers as much as we think they are. We have had a few exams this week with medical students, and like there was a high level of computer literacy and very basic things. They hadn't downloaded Microsoft Word. So like the pilot will help us make sure the summer exams, students should know that, but you expect everybody to be on the same level that they're not. So they're going to be grappling with the usual things that everybody will be dealing with. And then they're going to be doing their exams online. They're either going to be open book, assignment, real-time exams, and they're going to be under the stress of all of those things involved with the connectivity issues and where they live and so on. So the disability things are just the thing on top of that, which is just going to double the disadvantage if you want to look at it in another way to try and explain the difficulties the students will have. So I think there's a new way for everybody, and there's also the thing that students with disabilities always have to deal with, and that can't be forgotten now, because you need to, it's important that people out there don't get a sense and think, oh, sure, we've done enough, aren't sure aren't they grand what we're doing. And that isn't the attitude that people should have. Reasonable accommodations are legal requirements that are set in law, and disability officers are responsible, and we tell institutions that's their responsibility to do that. So I think we're all in this together, and I think the attitude, and well, my institution, and Laura's sort of equated her own as well, is very positive, and I don't imagine that anybody out there really doesn't want to do this. So we just have to make sure that we're always getting that voice in the room.
Yeah, no, very, very, very good point. And I suppose I'd like to highlight as well that there's a lot of VET practitioners in the room today. Maybe they're not blessed with the same levels of kind of institutional support you would have as well in there. Just to say that, you know, if there is questions out there from VET practitioners, AHEAD is here to support you, and I'm sure as well your local ETB will provide that support and advice.
It's also in relation to professional courses, like where we have up to 20 professional courses in Trinity, and there's a whole area of work that we need to challenge these bodies as well. Be very rigid and they think that they have these rules that are written back in 1592 when Trinity was set up, for example, that they think they can apply some rule that makes no sense. There's nothing that can be measured around something obscure rules that they present as a reason for doing something in one way. We drilled down into all of the courses, and we went back to all of the courses and asked them to show us the evidence where it states you have to do this exam in this way. And that's the sort of stuff that you need to sort of be challenging. Like, there's a lot of professional bodies like think, oh, this is the only thing that ever do it. In a crisis situation, people change, they adapt, and we need to make sure we bring this stuff into the future, not just now. Stuff that we're doing now is revolutionary, and it's really good stuff. So we need to make sure we capture it now and learn from where we go in the future, and not to be going back to the old ways, because that's the way we always did it. The problem that I face, and one of the things, I'm just going to finish on this now, is a lot of the stuff they decided to do for everybody in this no disadvantage thing were all the reasonable accommodations we did always for students with disabilities. They're now adding in the flexibility. They're allowing people to sit their first exam in a supplemental for the first time. They're allowing them to do another exam if they want. There's so many things that they could do for everybody to take a lot of the stress out of the system. I think there's a lot of learning going on here, and it'd be good if we could all capture it somewhere.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think, again, that piece around the flexibility is just key. And it's only making this situation is only highlighting what's actually there already in people's lives that we maybe weren't paying enough attention to prior to this situation. I'm just going to move to you, Laura, just for a final piece, final word on this. Just if you had one piece of advice for lecturers designing assessment now and looking at that, what would it be?
I think very much keep the student at the centre of it, like you always have before. That's really important. The students are the experts themselves in terms of the support that they need, and that's why you know, in every disability service in the country, you'll do needs assessments with the student. You're not just reading a report and taking things from that. You're meeting the students and you're capturing their experience. They're the experts in terms of their own needs. So I think it's really important to keep them at the centre of the whole process. I think like a big thing would be to like liaise with people, take the help that's there, collaborate, share your experiences. That's how we all learn. And I think, as Declan said, like absolutely, this is an opportunity for us. This is a golden opportunity for us in terms of how we learn from this experience and take it with us and go forward. So in terms of lecturing, I think like, you know, hopefully a lot of lecturers will see, I know there's been a very short time frame in terms of implementing all of this, but hopefully they will see, I suppose, that students largely are having a positive experience, hopefully, and that, you know, it's not as difficult maybe going forward to put things up online, because I think, again, like that could be the difference between a student coming into third level education and having to apply for support through the DSS or not. And students really should be able to come into college and have that accessible experience without having to apply for support with the DSS unless they absolutely need it, unless they can't do exams without reasonable accommodations, all of those things. So I think that's really important as well. I think there's a lot of learning here. Ask the questions, collaborate, share your experiences, use the community in your college. And I think don't forget that the DSS are there in terms of support. And to liaise with us and to ask us the questions if you don't know, but most of all, liaise with your students. They're the ones that likely have the answers as well.
So guys, thank you very much. I think there's a wealth of advice out there for lecturers in what you said, and I think you've raised some really big issues as well for us as an organisation to look at moving forward. Particularly that piece around the professional bodies, it's something that we're hearing as well. So it's definitely something that needs to be looked at going forward. I'd like to thank both of you for that. That was really, really insightful. And if you guys wouldn't mind just muting your microphone and video. I think Declan is going to join us later on again for the panel, but we're going to move to the next section. So Mark, if you could unmute yourself, your video and audio, and Trevor, if you could do the same, please. And Mark, if you could just begin to look to share your screen. Trevor, I'm going to hand the reins over into your capable hands now. I suppose just before I go, a few people have just mentioned around their FET survey and about sharing the results and stuff. So just to highlight those two surveys again, one is the student survey, which is a tertiary survey. It's for students in FET and in higher education. I'm sorry, I say tertiary, it's also anybody in FET, so community education as well. So that's up on the website, and it's about trying to capture some of the student experience, how they're finding the move online, what are the big challenges, what can we do to help. And there's also then a FET practitioner survey, which is trying to look at from the practitioner's perspective, what have been the challenges in teaching from home, and also in supporting students with disabilities directly in that context. So both of those should be live on the website now. Please do share them, and we will of course share the results, the major key information coming back from that through the website, and that will also really help us in feeding into the policy groups that we're sitting on in the Department of Education too. So Trevor, how did you find that, the first two sessions there? Are you on the line with us, Trevor?
You're muted, Trevor.
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay.
I can hear you now. Yeah,
So,
how are you doing?
good. Well, I have to say, Laura's words of community collaboration, support, and sharing just seem to keep reiterating in my mind. It just seems to be a common theme between either students and lecturers, and that to, you know, keep in contact with each other, keep sharing information, and keep that kind of dialogue kind of going in order to keep that kind of solution-based approach to the situation. So I just found it positive, and kind of it's going to take me by surprise, and I'm really delighted to hear that.
Right, well, I'm going to hand over to you, Trevor, if you're capable. And just to say, there is one question from a student in the group asking about a very specific situation in their university. If I'd like to urge you to send in your query to ahead@ahead.ie, and we can actually make a direct connection there with you and give you a call back on that query. So just to hand over to you, Trevor.
Brilliant. Well, I want to introduce Dr. Mark Lynn, who online last week got me thinking all differently about technology when he rose the issue about technology and pedagogy and the relationship between both. So definitely, Mark, thanks very much for those insights last week. And and if I can hand it over to you now, I'd be more than delighted to mute my video as well. Is that okay, Mark?
It is. Can you see my screen okay? Can you see the slides?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
Great stuff. So thanks very much, Trevor, and thanks, Dara, for the invitation. I want to talk to you about moving inclusively online for the assessment, but from the pedagogy point of view, from the teaching angle. As was touched on earlier on by our previous speakers, there's tons of technology out there, there's tons of different bits and pieces we can do, but I want to think primarily about teaching. And my logic behind this, and this is my mantra within DCU, is the fact that if you put teaching first, or if you put technology first, teaching will be second, or will be third, or will be fourth. Teaching must always be first, in my opinion, and technology, let that be somewhere further down the list. And that's saying that as somebody that is a self-confessed techie geek. When it comes down to it, I'm a big fan of technology, but it should only be used in the most appropriate circumstances. So to give you a little bit of a background about myself before I go too deep in, I work in DCU, as you'll see there from the slides. I head up the Teaching Enhancement Unit, and for us, the Teaching Enhancement Unit, every one of us have different names for different centres. It's our Teaching and Learning Unit within DCU. And we are specifically concerned with the teaching and learning and the staff development, as opposed to direct contact with the students. We have our excellent student support services, student support and development, that have the face-to-face contact with students. We deal primarily with staff and what happens within the classroom. So the slides I just want to go through with you here today is, I just want to remind you, who are we talking about when we're talking about assessment? And this is crucial because we lose sight of who we are, who we're looking for. And if we don't design for someone in particular, we design for no one. And what I want to do is I want to give you three personas here, right? The persona of Jane, John, and Mary. So Jane is your typical 18-year-old student, left school, one of three siblings, and maybe they're all in college. Okay, now this week, they're living all cramped up in their house and probably killing one another and killing the parents. John, 32-year-old, single parent, again, lives in the suburbs, but a completely different perspective to Jane. And then we look at Mary, who's a 21-year-old, and she's a first-class honours student, always came top of her class, but she lives out in the sticks. She lives in the back end of Wicklow, and indeed when it's a normal day, she is commuting an hour and a half each way to college. All right, so there are your 3 different student personas that I want you to think of when we're talking about assessment. And these are the conversations that I have with my staff in recent weeks where they've been thinking about, I need to redesign my assessment. Let's add into it. Let's add in the accessibility angle of it. And let's just say Jane has a family member. Now remember, she's living, let's just say, in a 3-bedroom semi-D in Dublin, but her family member is severely autistic. Now we're going to set an assignment for this lady that's going to require her to sit in a spare room somewhere or at the kitchen table or wherever she can get a find space. And we're going to say to her, you have to be in a quiet environment for 3 hours. That's practically impossible, right? Look at John, who's the single parent. He's also dyslexic, so maybe it's not just a 3-hour exam he needs. As was rightly pointed out by the speakers earlier on, they need additional time, additional complexity. Now he has a 3-year-old tugging at his arm, saying, where are you, Daddy? Where are you, Daddy? Can I have this? Can I have this? How do you turn on Peppa Pig? Or whatever the case may be, right? And we want them to sit still in a confined private environment for 2 hours or 3 hours to do an exam. These are the people that we are teaching. These are the people that we are assessing, and these are the people we must design for. And let's look at Mary, the 21-year-old student. Maybe we didn't know that she has severe arthritis, or she has technology that has helped her deal with that, and indeed medication, of course, but technology that's helped her deal with that, which has helped it masked from the lectures in the lecture hall. And now we're asking her to sit for 2 hours or 3 hours and write on a piece of paper. You know, so we need to be inclusive in our exams from the onset, regardless of COVID-19. But COVID-19, this the restrictions that it's led on us is really putting the challenge up to us, and we need to take that into consideration. And I do want to echo the thoughts from earlier on, where one of the speakers, the lady, was saying that it's been great lectures, have been sharing stuff, staff have been sharing stuff. Absolutely brilliant. The sense of community in higher education, I couldn't fault at all. But we need to be mindful that we are not assessing for a large portion, we are assessing for everybody. And if we take our approach to assessment as we should take our approach for teaching, if we take our approach to assessment, that it is universal design for learning, universal design for assessment. That's the approach that I want to encourage people to take. So let's look at assessment now, and let's look at it pre-COVID-19 versus what we have now. We're always trying to strike the balance between continuous assessment and the exam hall. And I always get arguments from staff saying, well, no, well, I can only have 30% CA, or I can only have 30% final exam, whatever the case may be. In each cases, we need to make special accommodation in our assessments. But if you design the assessment from the onset to be inclusive, then there'll be less and less accommodation, special accommodation that's needed. That's not saying that the people, there's anything wrong with the people that need that accommodation. Absolutely, we should support them in every way we can. But whether we're talking about pre-C19 or whether we're talking about now, we should try from the onset to design the assessment to be inclusive. Assessment absolutely must be authentic, must be valid, must be reliable, and must have academic integrity. There's tons of different options open for you, but you must meet those 4 criteria. The options are there. You could ask the student to submit a project online, if it's an individual work, a document, an image, a spreadsheet, whatever the case may be. It could be individual or group work. They could do online quizzes. Video submissions. My own daughter suffers from anxiety, doesn't show up on any disability index within or report within her university, but when she was told in 2nd year that in 4th year she would have to make a presentation, she started having panic attacks. So what she had ended up doing was, we got accommodation where she recorded herself doing the presentation and then played the presentation at the front of the class and answered questions thereafter. Now, the reason why I bring that out as an example is to drive home the fact that that assessment, that lecturer was flexible enough to do it, so flexible, in fact, the rest of the semester, he decided to use that technique with everybody, because what was he doing? Not assessing their ability to present live in front of an audience. The learning outcome was, could they communicate their knowledge about a particular topic? How they communicate it was up to them. So again, we need to look at the existing environment that we're in now, looking at the alternatives, and make sure they're inclusive. And I know Gavin is going to talk about the technology options in front of you, but there are so many different ways that each one of these methods can be more inclusive than your typical exam hall, end of semester, 2-hour-long exam. I know I only have 10 minutes, so I am going to wrap up here. But I want to wrap up by reminding you, who are we assessing? Keep that in your mind. We wouldn't know that Jane has this severely autistic family member. We wouldn't know that John has a 3-year-old wanting to watch Peppa Pig at the same time that's coming out. And we wouldn't know that Mary has severe arthritis. Or maybe we're thinking from academic integrity, we're saying you should have a webcam and we should be able to look at you and analyze everything you're doing to ensure there was nobody else there in the room. Well, what about Jane, who's one of 3 siblings who's in college? Maybe the 3 of them are doing exams at the same time and there's one laptop in the family. Or maybe they don't even have a webcam. What are we going to do? Stop those students from doing the exam? I don't think so. We need to look and design our assessments to be inclusive from the get-go and make no excuses about it. That's where I'll stop. I know it will segue nicely into Gavin's session. If anybody wants my own contact details, there they are there. Okay.
God, Mark, thank you very much for that. I have to say, there was just one particular phrase now that stuck in my head. It's universal design for assessment. And I think that's just a huge topic now that will be kind of explored before and after this situation. It'll be really interesting to see how kind of colleges, universities, FET sectors try to make sense of all that in terms of kind of changing.
Assessment, it's no secret at all. Assessment drives learning. Yeah. So if we want learning to be encouraged, if we want learning to be improved, and we want universal learning, universal design for learning, we should have universal design for assessment, without a doubt.
Makes sense. Perfect. God, Mark, thanks very much. And if I can get Gavin to come online now. Gavin Hendrick is, I think, available. Yeah.
On my own show. Hello.
So he's with the Learning Technology Services. So Gavin, thank you very much. And Gavin last week was just getting me rethinking about accessibility, because it's kind of just taken over my life in the last few weeks. So using proper headings and alt tag images and that. So I think Gavin will probably talk a little bit more about that kind of stuff than I can possibly ever even try to do that. So Gavin, I'm going to switch off my mic and my video and just let you, make people's minds explode for just a few minutes.
Oh, I always blow people's brains. It's okay. I can guarantee it. I'd just like to comment just quickly on Mark's. I think when Mark is highlighting just about the individual's own personal constraints, but also their location constraints. I do think that UDL is the solution for management of assessments by constraints. And management by constraints is a standard project management thing. Just let's bring it into education.
Yeah. No, I like that. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, so, Gavin, out.
And here we go. I'll just share this, hopefully. Okay. So they mentioned LTS, which is my consulting firm, but Brickfield is the company which I work with around accessibility and UDL. So, but the key thing here is, I worked at one institution there a few years ago, and I think they had around 50 out of 1,000 staff who'd had really good training on their LMS. And then out of that, maybe 10 knew about WCAG and the sort of the technical side of accessibility for online content and so on. That's a very small amount of the 1,000. And when we don't train people on technology in general and the technology that they're using, either because they'll just make their own way through it, we're actually creating the problem of a lack of, we'll say, compliance, a lack of accessible content, because we're not ensuring they know how to use the system well, because then you can embed accessibility as just good practice. So one of the things, and in Ireland, I must admit, of most countries that I've worked in doing this kind of stuff, we seem to have this, I don't know, what's the word? No, it's not apathy, it's like distaste for sort of enforced technology training. You know, you wouldn't be allowed behind a car without at least having taken a test, but probably in some countries having taken lessons. So in any of the analysis and training and assessments that we do of institutions, we run across quite a lot of different standard issues. And one of the big areas is text, and the standard one is color contrast. You see people have come up with this really cool brand design, and they have to apply it. As someone said in one institution, it's the brand police, otherwise known as the marketing department. So they just come across with this, and you must use it on your systems and on your documents and your PowerPoints without checking if it's readable, if it's usable. And that's why it's really important that your technology choice allows people to change that. Then you've got descriptive links. Now, I must admit, this is one of the things which is a real bugbear for me for many years, when people have had links saying, click here, download now, or they have just the full URL. And I mean, the URL for something like dcu.ie is nice and short, but for some universities, or if you deep link to a page somewhere on their site, it could be going through https:// when you're using screen readers. It could be going for 45 seconds. And but if people don't know, they don't know. And then you've got things like avoid new window targets. And the specification here talks about don't use them unless you alert the user. So how many people put in a bracket opens a new window in a link where they want to open it in a new window because it's navigating away from their site? So either you ban it or you adopt a process that incorporates it. And I'm just going to check, there's various chats and stuff hammering along there. And so there's interesting, and then consistent naming. One of the discussions I was having there recently, they were talking about that there should be a level of predictability. And that means that when a student has 10 modules in their LMS and that they're going into them, that the naming convention should be somewhat similar for the PowerPoint slides of their different sessions they have. And ideally should also be in the same place, but consistent naming is key. And then you've got the different lists, and you've got the use of strong and of bold and so on. And these are the HTML aspects. And how many people actually get training on this kind of thing? I mean, if you want to drop into chat there, how many people have actually had training or by their institution on this kind of thing? It's not that common. The second most common issue we found, and I'll be showing an example later, is the thing about layout. And that's where you don't have a structure. You haven't got headings, you aren't using bullet points. I think somebody mentions there in one of the Q&As about a lecturer using pages and pages of bullet points. That's just someone who isn't putting the effort in to contextualize all the part. Bullets aren't for everything. They're for making specific things. And then hierarchies. Often you'll see online, especially, where a lecturer thinks that they're a web designer and will have made big text and given it a nice color, rather than actually using the heading structures. And that's just making it inaccessible for many people. It's also often making it look awful. I've seen green on pink and it's great. No, it's not great. And then you've got images. So alt descriptions. Often the platforms are at fault, sometimes as much as the lack of training of the user and lack of understanding. But if it says things like a description not necessary, or allows them to add an image without forcing them to make that decision of, actually I do or I don't add a description here. And making it a description, a huge amount of them were like image.jpg was the alt tag. Clearly that's not great. It's not good at all. And then you've got things like where you have really complex images used instead of creating a table, but it's around data. And you can't really describe the image unless it's actually creating a table with data. Or you have to give it a really good caption underneath it. And these are the kind of things that people struggle with. They want to drop an image in there because it's quick and easy rather than doing something that's more complex in time. And then, of course, pixelation and flashing, that's about the quality of the images that you use. That's really important as well. I've seen often people put a huge image up that's about 5 meg in size, and they only want to refer to one small part. But the person doesn't know how to crop an image. So they aren't able to focus in and just upload the image of a much smaller size. And actually, so when it's looked at on a small screen, it's actually the appropriate size as well. So they're the kind of things which around images. I'm just going to check, is there any other interesting things hammering in there? Sorry, oops, go back. On multimedia, I'm going to zip through these because we only have 10 minutes. Some of the key things here is about using accessibility. People talked about subtitles, and someone commented that the Zoom subtitles don't seem to be great or something, as one of the comments in the chat. You know, subtitles, if they're automated in pure AI, they're maybe not as accurate, and sometimes then you have them going through people as well. I'm not sure what the service is here, but it seems to be quite accurate subtitles, which is really good. Then you've got the actual player that might be in a learning management systems, whether they are accessible or even allow people to add subtitles. And accessibility isn't also just about the subtitles for multimedia, it's allowing them to be maybe download offline so they don't have to stream them over the really poor Wi-Fi connections they have. And then obviously providing a transcript as an alternate option, and that's really the UDL approach. So you have your video and your transcript, and it might be much more than just what the audio is. It might be a full description on what's going on and more contextualization. Then you've got tables. People love using tables for layout. Oh, I just want to cry sometimes, I really do. And they don't use headings, they don't use captions, and you might go, hey, I don't know how to do that. Well, that's part of the challenge, that it is, when you're doing web stuff, you have to use those different parts correctly. It isn't about making it look amazing, it's about making it well and making it look as good as you possibly can. But it is something which you have to use these tools and these features appropriately. And one of the things with merge cells, that's also, it just makes it hard for people to navigate through that content. Oh, Prezi, one, I must admit, seasick. Two, people just do it because it's, wow, I don't know how accessible Prezi is. It might be completely accessible. Then you've got equations. There's so many different options out there to do it well, and it works both for teachers, and it's down to, again, often the editor. And then you've got some really cool tools like Wirus, which even enhance it further and include handwriting analysis and stuff, which is brilliant. Probably said that wrong. It's Wirus, isn't it? But it is about having the correct platform to enable you to do these as easily as possible, because you shouldn't need to know as a teacher or a student, because students create content in a learning platform, they shouldn't have to know about what's going on. I want to give you an example here of where accessibility becomes more than just the HTML. It becomes more about that understanding, being able to understand something, having it really perceivable. And here, if you get this as a typical instruction in an assignment for someone to do something, you know, I look at that, and I must admit, this is one of my pet bugbears, by the way. I mean, really, Mark will tell you that, oh, actually my wife would also tell you that. I'm constantly going, you know, 1 point per paragraph, 1 point per bullet point. This here has actually hidden information inside of it, because when you restructure it, there's 3 separate tasks. You've got instructions and you've got a deadline outlined separately. Rather than having a whole sentence that's bold, you're not actually emphasizing the key parts. And just laying something out helps everybody. And this is the UDL approach. It's about making it accessible to everyone. You're not just accommodating one or two people or a small percentage. And it's the same thing here with a reading list. You've got, again, here's a reading list, and you've the whole URL put out here. Same again. You just make it that it's actually the text. You know, it also looks cleaner on the page, but it's also more readable for people with screen readers. So why do it differently? Now, when we do some analysis, the kind of thing that we look at is we look at all of the courses or a teacher or a whole program, and we analyze, and we found that, and this was just a typical course that we found, so that's why I'm doing it, where assignments, out of 60, around 10 of them seem to have one or more problems. But then on the other ones, things like labels, this is specifically Moodle, because it's lots of HTML generally labeled, there's a lot more problems there per se. A lot of more of them fail those sort of QA tests. And then, of course, in the course descriptions as well, a lot of HTML going in there. So you do look at these things and you go, you know, once people are given free rein to start adding in lots of HTML, they sometimes run away with themselves unless they know how to do it well. And here's another view, and this is it's like a heat map on top of a Moodle course, and it's got a Moodle block over on the right hand side. So what we have here is we have both color, tick box, and text there stating that, like, the glossary has passed all of the QA checks. In this case, we had ran, I think it was 100 QA checks against all of the different courses in the whole platform. It generated 640 million QA checks, which is a lot of fun. Well, it wasn't a lot of fun for the server. I think it cried as well. And then here below that, there's actually a label there that's failed one of the checks because it's actually got some white space in there. And over on the right, we then have a block which summarizes to the teacher, well, actually, I've got no problems with my images. I have no problems with layout, but I do have 47 links that are a problem. I have 2 bits of media that are a problem, and I have 132 places where my text has problems. I think this is a key thing. You need to be able to support the teacher in situ. And this is performance support. It's literally helping them right at the point that they're doing things. And this is an example of where you use nudging in platforms to help them. So this image is descriptive or decorative only. Use the right language to talk to them, because then they'll go, oh no, this image isn't decorative. So then they're more, then they'll be more likely to write a description. Or and then there are lots of other places that kind of thing can be done. So it was an awful lot to digest in just 10 minutes or whatever it was. So thank you very much for that. And that's myself and my team. So.
Gavin, thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fantastic. Because you kind of answered kind of a couple of queries that I had with a blind student a few weeks ago. He's an incredible student, and he was just getting frustrated because of, you know, those simple kind of issues of not proper headings not being used in Word documents and alt tagging in images. So it was kind of affecting just his coursework, and all those kind of things that you mentioned would help, like, students like him in a really simple, effective way.
But it also helps everyone. If you open a Word document and someone hasn't used headings, it can try and guess what were headings. But that navigation structure, especially if it's a big document. So instead of people thinking that they're a desktop publisher and want to make something look really cool, and having spent a few days with InDesign, doing desktop publishing is not cool. But in a Word document, you do good structure. And Microsoft have some amazing resources and tutorials about creating good, accessible documents. You know, there's no excuse anymore, unless you don't have the latest version of Microsoft Office.
Okay. And they're really simple. Some of them are just really, really simple, and you start doing it without even thinking about it anymore. So that's the key. Well, I think we're coming up to break time.
I'm just wondering, Trevor, given we're running a bit late there, should we run straight into the panel, do you think, or should we take 2 minutes? Yeah. I think it's running a wee bit late, so I'm just wondering if it would suit better to make sure, because I know people will have other commitments to join.
Yeah. Will we just go with it? Yeah.
If you're okay with that. Is everybody else?
Yeah.
Gavin and Mark and Megan, would you be okay with us going straight in with the panel if you could to
no bother.
Unmute your stuff
Yeah,
there? And just to say that Declan has actually privately messaged me to say he was a kind of emergency came up at home, so he's had to scoot off, unfortunately. But if you like, Trevor, I can sit in at the panel, and if there's anything that's maybe relevant there, you can send it my direction.
That's okay. Well, one message that's kind of come up that I think is really interesting, and I'd love to kind of ask it to someone on the panel, and that's about, it's a message from Chris Ross. So he mentioned something about designing assessments from the outset with UGL principles is absolutely perfect. But he's mentioned then kind of restraints then in terms of, like, if you inherit possibly a module descriptor and you yourself could see the possibilities of UGL and assessment. You know, I'm wondering, could I fire that question kind of at someone on the panel?
I mean, I might just start. I think maybe what Chris is getting at as well is that some of the, particularly I know in a lot of the FEP programs, that some of the sort of assessment criteria are very strict, very kind of more rigid, maybe.
Oh, right. Okay.
I mean, one thing I would say is just that it's your interpretation of the criteria is important. I mean, I think somebody has mentioned in a previous thing something about demonstrating communication in a previous message through the chat here about demonstrating communication in a group setting. But of course, that communication in a group setting can be interpreted in very different ways. So it doesn't mean you can't still provide options to students. So communication can be like we're communicating here online via a video thing, or it could be via a chat message board if somebody is more comfortable with a text kind of input sort of thing. So that's one thing I'd say. Maybe, I'm sure Mark has loads of insight on this.
You'd have difficulty shutting me up, Dara. But no, what I would say is when we design programs, we start off with our learning outcomes as to what we want our graduate to be able to do at the end. Then we start thinking about assessment, and then we start thinking about the learning and teaching activities that we put in. So it's assessment comes first. So you actually can design your assessment, but the key is to have good, solid learning outcomes. And that particular example that you used, Dara, is crucial. If the learning outcome is phrased, and I've yet to see a learning outcome phrased where it says you have to speak using PowerPoint in front of the class of 20 students for 20 minutes. It doesn't say that. You have to demonstrate your ability to communicate topic X or topic Y, your knowledge of, right? So you do have that flexibility with assessments once you are meeting the learning outcomes.
I might come in here briefly as well, just and say I think something that this goes back to is the importance of having learners and students at the table the whole way through the process. Yeah. So you should be involving students in the design of programs and what the learning outcomes are, because when you have those voices at the table, I think you're a lot more likely to take into consideration the diversity of voices, and therefore you're going to get a better quality sort of learning outcomes out of it as well.
Okay. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. We would have students on our learning design panels for exactly that reason, to get the student voice in there.
Okay. Like, and kind of just going back to a point kind of Mark made earlier. Sorry, I've just been kind of thinking about it more, that kind of universal design for assessment, and kind of what Chris mentioned as well about assessment as well. Like, in module descriptors that we kind of see, for courses and modules within courses, like if it would be fantastic to finally see, something like UDL kind of built into the module descriptors. So as a lecturer, you could kind of see yourself about how you're kind of assessing students in different ways, but still conforming the assessments to the learning outcomes. And if that would be an aid for lecturers.
One of the ways, sorry if I can put in there, Trevor, one of the ways, the challenges that lecturers come to us with is around academic integrity. Right? Okay. Is around how am I going to stop my students cheating, or how am I going to ensure myself that it is the students' work, and so on. We did a lot of research in DCU around academic integrity, and specifically around assessment design. So how can we minimize the opportunity for plagiarism in the first place? And one of the major outputs of our research was these 12 principles of assessment design. And part of that, the reason why 12 principles of assessment design, the reason why I mentioned that is one of those, actually several of those, orientate around giving the student choice, making the assessment authentic, having student ownership. All of that is good UDL. All of that, well, like, you don't say, okay, every student should do this particular assessment and the blind student should do this form of the assessment. Yeah. Like, that level of isolation is just ridiculous. You should have, everybody should have the choice of the form of the assessment that they want to take once they meet the learning outcomes.
I think as well, there was a great example of that, just to jump in there, last week in our John Kelly Award final, the winner, Jennifer Lynch, who was a FEP practitioner from Marino College, showcased a perfect example of how you do a choice of assessment and do it well, maintain that academic integrity, maintain fairness for everybody. And it's one thing that bugs me, Mark, actually, the kind of concept of academic integrity sometimes being misinterpreted, in my view, is that, does it show integrity, academic integrity, to make a student with dyslexia sit a 3-hour exam that's all text-based?
Yeah, exactly. So academic integrity is 2 ways,
Exactly.
But to go back to have the student voice in there, I think it was Megan that said it, if I'm getting the voice properly, well, having the student voice in there is crucial.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's absolutely fantastic to hear. And then, because like even myself, the types of exams that, I just hate myself are the 3-hour sitting down writing exams. So like if I was to go back to college, alternative assessments would be something I would definitely avail of if there was a way of engaging with learning outcomes in a way other than sitting a 3-hour exam. So which is one of the reasons why I always loved kind of open book exams and very bespoke assignments. So in that way, through continuous assessment, you could be given very specific like essay type questions. I need to have a certain amount of time to answer them, and I actually found I got more out of that because you could kind of return to it, and rather than it being a memorization activity, it was more about just kind of like applying like learning theory or something to a situation you're in. So I wonder, would students be more open to open book exams given the options that are available now? And would it kind of get students to rethink, those kind of 3-hour sitting down kind of memorization kind of exams? And if so, would that be something that the future could look like here, where there could be more variety in terms of the types of like Christmas and summer exams?
Well, you think about it again in terms of accessibility and not wanting to focus by any stretch of the imagination on people with a disability. Just looking at the Jane, the John and the Mary there at their private sort of building, whether they're a single parent or whether they could be looking after an elder relation. Having that flexibility where they don't have to come in at Christmas to do an exam. Maybe they could do a short, fat module as opposed to a long, skinny module. I mean, stretching out over a semester or a year. Yeah. Maybe you could do it intensely over a week. Sure, why not? Absolutely, why not?
Fantastic. Okay. And then I suppose
So just on that, sure, Megan might have some, might be able to chime in on this as well. But one of the things you made in terms of this current situation is, we've gone back to flexibility. Personally, I think the actually only way that we can really ensure fairness for all students in this situation, given the diversity of context that people are working from, given all of the challenges that people have, is to provide choice. And that's my own opinion. It's actually the only way we can do this. And it's also that we have to consider low-tech options in that as well. Like I'm hearing in some of the groups, for example, some fantastic work that vet practitioners are doing, actually providing posted materials to some students who just don't have that device in their home, we don't have that broadband connection. So I think we need to be examining all options and providing students with as much flexibility and options in terms of how they're assessed. And I don't know, Megan might have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I'll come in briefly. I think I would echo what Dara has said there, that this is definitely thrown up. There's no one size fits all model, and definitely that people are having to sort of search around for solutions. So I think what we traditionally would have been at with assessment is we have this one particular model which we stick to, which is very restrictive, and then we try and go about making accommodations on the side for those who need it. But I definitely think this is, and I know there was a little bit of conversation about it in the chat, that there are big opportunities here to sort of capitalize on this as a universal design for learning approach, and how when it is embedded into the curriculum and into the teaching and learning and into the assessment, it's not something additional that has to be done, or it's not that people need to go above and beyond. It's that if you take it into account every step of the way, it makes it easier on everyone as well. And I think I would love to see, I just know from my experience in third level, I would love to see it move from what it has been so far, is that yes, it's starting to get recognition, but it's more on a sort of like an awards basis, as opposed to us actually seeing this as something fundamental that we need to move towards. And I kind of think that this situation, as some people have said, is giving opportunities for that.
Yeah, because even like that student voice, I've seen it myself, and it's quite powerful when it's on committees. I was on one, kind of a universal design accessibility one, and there was one student in particular who kind of drove a lot of kind of issues using that student perspective to inform a committee that was quite wide and diverse. And without her voice there, as a student with kind of Asperger's, you know, we would have been less mindful of certain, you know, developments within the institution. So I don't know, that valuable insight, whether it's in any kind of type of committee, students either with or without disabilities, would be great. But again, that student disability voice, I think, is becoming more common and more mainstream as well within different committees. So I wonder, would that happen kind of within, you know, the assessments conversation that we're having now, and then will there be feedback kind of taken from students about, you know, the types of online assessments that they would have, and how would that be captured, and how would institutions kind of take that on board in the long term? I suppose that's ultimately where my mind is going about, like, after this situation, you know, I'd hope to think that the learning from this could be a way of kind of future-proofing education in the long run, as well as, you know, opening up maybe people's minds to diversity of assessment types as well. And so I suppose, Courtney and Megan, I'd love to kind of hear about, like, do you know students already who kind of engaged in alternative assessments, and how are they feeling about it?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will say just briefly, because you had mentioned it there about committees, and I think obviously student feedback and input is really valuable, but one thing that we would always stress is that you need to bring students up to that level in order to engage. So, you know, sometimes if someone is the only student on a committee, and it takes a while, I think, to get used to the language used at committee levels. And I've seen circumstances before where students would definitely like to be able to iterate their views and the views of their classmates, but they just don't feel equipped to do so. So I think that when students are being taken on board, as they should be, that they should definitely be, you know, inducted, for want of a better word, because particularly when it comes to student representatives, and I know I've been one myself, you're only there for a year or so, and it's a very short amount of time to get to grips with the committee, where people might have been sitting on it for 6 or 7 years. So just to make that point, I suppose, and then on the assessment question, we're still kind of trying to gather feedback from learners and see what their experience of it has been. But I definitely think that there has been more flexibility in the approach, and we have actually received a lot of positive feedback as well, and people had been talking about that, about how those online classes are going. And I suppose we're kind of coming up to assessment time now, so people are sort of waiting to see what's going to happen in that sphere. But I think overall the dialogue and the communication has been quite positive.
Great. Okay, that's fantastic. And actually, just something about Gavin. I'm just wondering, Gavin, with the types of questions and queries you're getting from lecturers, could you kind of give us a sense of what some of those questions have been that you've had to kind of deal with over the last few weeks?
Well, it's actually, it's sort of interesting. So I think over about, I think it was 12 hours, I had 5 institutions engage with me with, and asking about secure online assessment. Okay. And it was, how do we lock down the student's computer? And I'm going, so you think they have a computer at home? Okay. And yeah, we want to make sure we're using real sort of live proctoring so we can see them while they're taking it. I'm going, okay, so you think they've got a webcam at home, and you think that they've got a strong enough internet connection that any of that could happen? Okay. And how many do you know actually have that? Of course, they hadn't asked. They had no idea. And so they have this fear about academic integrity. They have this fear that if they do an assessment which doesn't meet the expectations of the students and the institution, that it'll be sort of not approved. And so they are concerned. And I do think a switch to open book exams for a huge amount of programs is the way I've recommended it for most. Not because in the real world, if there is a real world after this pandemic, in the real world, people actually work open book every day. I've got 3 screens in front of me for a reason. I have reference materials, creating and whatever. So, and for the high stake exams, replicating a work environment isn't a bad thing. And but there are there's also another a trick that you can do. So when I took a statistics exam, and it wasn't really an exam, it was more like 6 in a row, they chained together 5 assessments where you basically were given the equivalent of a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet with data in it, and you could do 5 or 6 things and then upload it. And once you uploaded it, you then got access to the second assignment. They used a thing called restrict access. And then when you then got the corrected version of what the spreadsheet should have been, and then you did the next steps on it. So it's like this iterative project that you were, and even if you made a mistake on one of the steps, the material you got to do the next step was correct. And that was another nice way of doing it, because you were getting them to work with material they didn't have. So I think there are many creative ways. There was an interesting question, though, if I can jump into it there. Declan Kennedy in UCC asked about it. What do we recommend to avoid online teaching? It's actually really interesting, because that's one of the other things that came up. I had people going, hey, I need to record my lectures. You know, flipped classroom has been around for how long?
Quite a while.
Quite a while.
Yeah.
This has basically, but institutions have never been able to use that M word, the mandate, right, to ensure everybody started doing these things, or even going online. And COVID came along and said, hold my glass, I'll sort this. And and I don't mean to be flippant about it, but it has forced us to address, stop just sitting in a lecture, giving 55 minutes of a lecture, and give them the recording, and then have an active learning session if you do have a synchronous session. And I think that's good. I think that's a really good thing to, and if we ever get back into the lecture halls or classrooms again, keeping that flipped classroom piece, I think, will be absolutely important.
Yeah. No,
okay, Trevor. Sorry, I know we're coming to quite close enough to the end of the session, but I just wanted to pick up actually on a comment in the chat box here, from Marie Monaghan, who's just made a comment about. She said in light of Mark's comment that there should be assessment options available for learning outcomes. Wondering if FET practitioners have been limiting assessment options due to the QQI criteria, not fair and consistent assessment. I think actually, if you look in the QQI assessment guidelines, they're actually quite clear about the sort of openness to flexibility in how the learning outcomes are met. And even in terms of this particular crisis, Marie, I don't know if you've seen that QQI have released a specific set of guiding principles for alternative assessments, and they've gone as far in that in those guiding principles to actually say that learning outcomes which are kind of incidental and non-achievable in relation to the current situation can be removed. And they've gone as far as to say that. So, for example, in practical courses where there's a very specific learning outcome that requires a practical demonstration of something, that those can be removed or in some cases replaced. So I think QQI have demonstrated some flexibility on this. Marie, but maybe you might have some different views you could throw back into the chat box. That'd be great. Trevor, I don't know what's. Are we going to finish up soon? Do you think, or?
Yeah, I kind of think so. There's just a few questions kind of coming in, just about kind of UDL being new to the FET sector, but I think that'll. People are just kind of talking about kind of an approachingness and willingness to engage with it, and this kind of situation might kind of promote that kind of thinking within it. But I think for me, I'm kind of done unless there's something. Will I wrap up with kind of tomorrow's kind of exciting webinar for the 10 weeks of webinars?
Yeah, absolutely. If you could do that, and just while you're getting that up, just to reiterate, we'd really appreciate if you could all share both the student survey and the FET practitioner survey. I'll actually throw some links into the chat box here, and I'll throw some links for that in that QQI guidance on assessment in there as well. And just a big, huge thanks to all of our contributors. Thought it was a really fascinating session, and one that kind of gave us viewpoints from all the different perspectives that we need to hear in this conversation. Trevor, are you ready more or less to share that?
Yeah. just my computer is deciding to pop up loads of windows. Great. So I think that, is that visible?
Yeah, we can see the PowerPoint.
Great.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Well, tomorrow is yet another exciting webinar with our Online Ahead conference. So if you're interested in communities of learning and study abroad, there's 3 incredibly good presentations happening about UDL. So from Ireland, we've got Trevor Ball from Maynooth University, who's talking about design thinking and creating kind of communities of practice within that. And then from our very own Ahead, we've got the wonderful Hannah Kelly, who'll be talking about inclusive mobility. And that's kind of going to delve into kind of things about Erasmus and maybe kind of a few other kind of factors where students might be doing kind of working kind of as part of their studies. So that's, I think, quite kind of a good one. That's kind of a new one that I'd love to kind of I'm looking forward to seeing that myself. And then we have a presentation from North Florida by Dr. Suzanne Ehrlich and Michelle Bradlett. So shifting to DGL mindset in the workplace practice and learning design. And as always, those will be recorded, but I think there are definitely 3 I'm going to be interested in. And then just remind people about like next week, which is Friday again. And as always, our webinars are at 2:30. It'll be about UDL and designing for diversity. So there's 3 presentations again. From Ireland, we've got kind of a great one with Dr. Lisa Padden, who I've been working with myself, and she does fantastic work, and that's in collaboration with Dr. Barbara Fleming. And then from outside Ireland, then we've got Dr. Sean Bracken from Worcester, as well as kind of far afield as Kentucky, and also great to see kind of like the diversity of UDL kind of across the continents. So that'll be another good one to see as well. So please feel free to log in to those. They're free, and again, they're on the same web page, which is like Ahead, it's the Conference 2020 web page. If you follow us on social media, please use the hashtag Ahead 2020, and we'll be kind of sending kind of updates about times and dates, as well as web page links to kind of go and register. So thanks very much for your time, and really appreciate your time for this long weekend that's ahead of us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Trevor.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay. Thank you.